The ending of I'm Not Afraid delivers an emotional conclusion that finally exposes the kidnapping conspiracy, while reminding us that the story has never really been about crime alone. Although Felipe's rescue brings justice to those responsible, the finale's heartbreaking final moments revolve around Miguel, whose sacrifice transforms the entire series into a coming-of-age story about courage, forgiveness, and the choices that define who we become. Throughout the series, the adults have tried to protect themselves by sacrificing everyone else. Every lie, betrayal, and act of violence has been motivated by fear of being exposed. That carefully constructed web finally begins to unravel when Detective Curiel notices a pattern in the anonymous phone calls pointing toward Felipe's location. Instead of dismissing the tips individually, he realizes they're all connected to Emilio's ranches and employees, allowing the investigation to zero in on the people responsible. At the same time, panic spreads among the kidnappers. Rodrigo and Rosa decide the situation has become impossible to control. Others begin turning against one another, while some consider taking their reward money and disappearing before the police arrive. Their unity completely collapses because it was never built on loyalty, it was built on fear. Ironically, the people who actually solve the case aren't the detectives, they're the children. Rather than waiting for adults to save the day, Chava, Barbara, Tonio, Calavera, Maria, and Miguel follow their own clues into the abandoned sugar mill beyond the terrifying misty forest. The forest had symbolized childhood fear throughout the series, but by repeatedly telling themselves, I'm not afraid, the children overcome both the physical danger and the emotional fear that has controlled their lives. When they finally hear Felipe calling for help and break him out, it's the first truly hopeful moment of the finale. The children succeed where every adult has failed. One of the finale's most important moments comes during the confrontation on the highway. Rodrigo still believes the only way to escape justice is to kill Felipe before he reaches the police. He's willing to murder a child simply to erase the last witness. Pino, however, reaches his breaking point. Although he participated in the kidnapping, watching events spiral toward the murder of innocent children forces him to confront the person he's become. When Rodrigo prepares to shoot Felipe, Pino tackles him to stop the execution. That decision doesn't erase his earlier crimes, but it shows that even someone deeply guilty can refuse to sink even further. Sadly, the struggle has devastating consequences. Rodrigo fires the gun anyway. Instead of hitting Felipe, the bullet strikes Miguel. It's a cruel twist because Miguel had spent the entire story risking himself to save someone else. The finale deliberately leaves Miguel's ultimate fate somewhat ambiguous on screen, but every emotional cue strongly suggests that Miguel dies from his gunshot wound. After being shot, Miguel speaks calmly to his father rather than asking for help himself. Instead, he tells Pino to take care of Teresa and Maria and never forget him. These aren't the words of someone expecting to recover, they're farewell words. His voiceover that follows also feels like a final reflection on his own life rather than thoughts spoken after surviving. Instead of focusing on pain or fear, Miguel reflects on what he's learned from his friends. Nobody is born completely good or completely bad. That realization becomes the central message of the series. Miguel begins the story living among adults whose lives are dominated by greed, violence, and fear. By every circumstance, he could have followed exactly the same path. Instead, his friendship with Felipe and the other children changes him. His final narration argues that people are not born as heroes or villains. They're shaped by their choices. Throughout the season, the adults repeatedly choose fear. They lie, they kidnap, they betray one another, and they convince themselves that more violence will somehow solve their problems. The children make the opposite choices. They trust one another, they remain loyal, they forgive, and most importantly, they refuse to abandon Felipe even when rescuing him places all of them in mortal danger. Miguel recognizes that those friendships allowed him to become someone better than the adults around him. Even though he cannot undo everything his family has done, he can decide what kind of person he wants to be. That is why his final words carry so much emotional weight. The phrase, "I'm not afraid," appears several times during the finale, but its meaning changes dramatically. At first, it's simply something the children repeat while crossing the frightening misty forest. They're trying to convince themselves to keep moving. By the ending, however, those same words represent something much deeper. Miguel is no longer talking about monsters hiding in the woods. He's no longer afraid of the adults controlling his life. He's no longer afraid of telling the truth. And in his final moments, he isn't even afraid of death. Instead, he faces everything with the courage he learned through friendship. The title ultimately becomes less about fear itself and more about overcoming it. By the end of the finale, the criminal conspiracy completely falls apart. Curiel's investigation finally uncovers the network responsible for Felipe's kidnapping, leading to the arrest of Rosalio, Margarita, and several others connected to the operation. Felix also breaks under interrogation and identifies additional members of the group, causing the entire organization to collapse from within. Rodrigo's willingness to murder Felipe ultimately destroys any remaining illusion that the kidnappers were simply desperate people making bad decisions. The finale makes it clear that fear gradually pushed many of them toward increasingly unforgivable choices. Pino, meanwhile, occupies a far more complicated position. He openly admits, "I'm a bad person." It's one of the most honest moments in the entire series. He doesn't ask for forgiveness or make excuses for his actions. Instead, he finally accepts responsibility while desperately trying to save the son he failed to protect. Although the finale ends on an incredibly heartbreaking note, it ultimately delivers a hopeful message. Felipe survives, the kidnapping ring is exposed. The adults responsible are finally forced to face justice. Most importantly, Miguel proves that people are not trapped by the mistakes of their families. His final reflection suggests that love, friendship, and compassion can interrupt even the darkest cycles of violence. The adults repeatedly insist that survival requires sacrifice in others. The children prove exactly the opposite. In the end, "I'm Not Afraid" argues that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing kindness despite it. Miguel's final words transform the series from a kidnapping thriller into a story about redemption, showing that while no one is born entirely good or evil, every person has the power to choose who they become.